Welcome to Conversations in North Dakota History, sponsored by the State Historical Society of North Dakota. I'm Virginia Heidenreich from the State Historical Society, and today we're talking with Dr. Fred Schneider, professor from the University of North Dakota, about North Dakota archaeology. Dr. Schneider, I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about what interests archaeologists in North Dakota prehistory.
Thank you.
There are quite a variety of issues that are facing archaeology today in North Dakota, and certainly one of the major issues has been the question of preservation of historic and prehistoric archaeological resources. And that's always a pressing problem and will remain one into the future. After all, if we can't do much archaeology if we don't have anything out there to study. So part of the problem has been to try to educate the public and work with various state officials and trying to better preserve and interpret the state's resources. But beyond that, in terms of more specific archaeological interest, I guess we'd have to look at 3 or 4 issues that are before us today. Certainly one of the issues that's been a part of North Dakota archaeology since its beginnings has to do with the origins and development of the various Earth Lodge peoples, the Plains Village peoples. And here I'm talking about peoples that historically we know as the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara. This was a culture that was very distinctive, not only here in North Dakota but in the Plains, a culture that we can trace back in the archaeological record, but we still don't know much about their early beginnings. That is, how did these people begin to, or why did they begin to adopt this way of life that was quite distinct and different from the ways of life of other peoples in the Plains? For instance, why would people begin to use domesticated plants? How did they do this? When did they do this? Are issues that are still with us today and have been with us for the last 100 years in terms of archaeology. So that whole area is one of the areas of interest. Another area which has been with us for a long time and will remain so is to investigate the very first signs of human presence in North Dakota, the so-called Paleo-Indian cultures, the very earliest cultures in this area. We know very, very little about these people that lived here 10,000, 11,000 years ago. People throughout the state have found artifacts, spearpoints, from this time period, but we know very little about these people other than the fact that they made a lot of spearpoints and left them throughout the state. But we don't know much about their campsites, the kinds of animals they hunted, and so forth and so on in North Dakota. We do in other parts of the Plains, but not here. So that's an ongoing question then. Where are these campsites? Where do these people live, and how do they live once they were here in North Dakota? Those are 2 of the issues. There are lots of others too that we might talk about, but I think that those might highlight the 2 important ones in my mind.
In North Dakota, particularly in the western part of the state, we can walk over land that looks a little different than it did during the buffalo hunting days. How can archaeologists look at the geography and have ideas about how early peoples might have used the land, and how then would the context of a few arrow points or other artifacts help to have them interpret the setting further?
I think we have to, in answering that question, I think we have to stop and realize that prehistoric people, just as ourselves today, don't live on and use the landscape in a random fashion. That is, if we stop and look at historic events here in North Dakota, that is where towns were established and farms and how people today use the land, we discover that there are certain factors, certain reasons why towns are built in one spot and not another, why farms of one type are in one portion of the state than in another. And the same thing holds true in the past. Even though people had slightly different technologies and were doing different kinds of things, they still were living on and using the land. So that it becomes very important then to the archaeologists to have some understanding as to what the relationship is between archaeological sites and artifacts to the landscape. so that we begin to build up a picture then as, for instance, a particular group of people or group of culture in the past may use certain landforms, that is, certain hills, kinds of hills, exposures, perhaps to the sun, to the wind, to the winter camps, whatever it might be. Peoples will use the landscape in slightly different fashions throughout time. So as we begin to look at the locations of archaeological sites and artifacts and begin to record these and map them out across the state, we build up a picture then of how people were using the land at certain periods of time in the past. The people are also extracting from the land different kinds of resources, so that people may live in some areas because they find readily available stone for making stone tools. In other areas they may be using wood for fuel or construction purposes, or there may be areas that have abundance of some type of natural wild plant food or animal food that occur on perhaps a seasonal basis. So that looking at distributions of plants, animals, looking at landforms, looking at soil types in combination with the locations of artifacts and archaeological sites begins to give us a clue then as to how these people lived in the past. Obviously, we'll never know exactly how these people were living, and we're using a lot of analogy or a lot of thoughts from what we observe historically. But we have to be careful to not assume that just because, say, the Mandan or the Dakota or the Assiniboine or whatever group we may want to refer to here in the state, just because they lived a way of life in a certain fashion historically, we have to be careful to not assume that that same way of life existed 1,000 or 5,000 years earlier in time. It may have been a different ballgame altogether, and perhaps, I think, was. The environment would have been different, climate would have been different, and technology would have been different at that earlier time. But it does give us a clue to interpreting the past.
When you excavate a site and find a spear point or an arrow point, what can you learn from that as you look at it?
Well, there's quite a bit that we can learn about and understand about arrowheads and spear points when we excavate them. For instance, this spear point, if we were to find this in an excavation, immediately there'd be a number of questions that the archaeologist would ask and could perhaps even answer right at that point without further analysis. One of the first questions might be, of course, in mind is, what is this made out of? What type of stone? And the reason that question might be of importance to us is to perhaps give us clues about not only the age of this particular projectile, but also, is it made of a stone that is from this area, or is it of a stone that perhaps is not found in the area and had to either have been traded or brought into the area either by the people who left it at this site or traded from some other group of people? So knowing then the kind of stone is very critical. Is it a stone that is locally available, or is it has to come from some other spot? Is it very abundant? Is it a type of stone that we can find on the surface of the ground, or is it a type of stone that people have to quarry or mine out of rock or whatever for? In North Dakota, for instance, this type of stone is called Knife River flint, this dark brown flint. And we know that prehistoric peoples as well as historic peoples mined this flint in western North Dakota.
Has this flint been found in other places beside North Dakota?
This flint is native to North Dakota, but was traded throughout most of the central part of the country, so that we would also find our North Dakota flint in Colorado or Kansas City or even as far west as Calgary, Alberta. So it was a very highly prized type of stone, very distinctive stone. And to archaeologists then, it's a very handy reference. Once we see this type of stone, we can recognize it for what it is. Another question we might have is, obviously, how old is this? And that's a question that the public ask us very frequently. Probably the first question they ask is, how old is that arrowhead or that spear point? And of course, looking at it by itself, we can't say much about that. However, once we know where this came from, that is the context, where was it found and what was it found with, then we start to build up our information about its age. Now, because this style, and by the way, this is called a Scott's Bluff projectile point, this style is very distinctive of a period of time roughly from about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, has been found repeatedly in excavated context where we've been able to find particular species of animals, the animals that were hunted and killed by these people. We find these in geologic context, that is buried in different strata in the ground. We've been able to radiocarbon date things and so forth. So we now have built up a fairly good idea when we find one of these, even if it's just lying on the surface of the ground, because it is so distinctive that we can be certain that that single object, probably 99% probability of that guess, that it dates from that time period and is that type of point, that is the Scott's Bluff point. Now another important question is, what did they do with this? Now we pick up something like this and we look at it and we say, well, that's a spear point. And indeed it probably is, but we want to know for certain. We'd like to know, is that actually a spear point or did it have some other purpose? And so we get into a whole realm of what's called experimental archaeology, in which then archaeologists attempt to learn how to make these, that is, how did these people actually make these, but also how do they use them. So what happens then if we take an object like this and use it to impale, say, a buffalo or a deer, and then perhaps we use the same specimen to butcher that animal? What happens when we cut meat as versus hide? What happens when we scrape bone as versus wood? All of those things leave little marks and wear on the sides that under a good microscope we can detect, and they're very distinctive. And one of the things we discover is a lot of these things that we call spear points, in fact, were used for a whole variety of other purposes. In fact, may have been used more as cutting and scraping tools than actually as projectiles. I think we can envision someone using this on the end of a spear, killing an animal, withdrawing the spear, and then using it to cut up and butcher the animal with. And we know that can happen and has happened in the past. So that's another kind of research, another kind of question we could ask about that. I mentioned earlier the manufacture of that. How do we go about making something like that? That's very distinctive and different from other styles of spear points and later arrow points. And each of these requires a slightly different technique of manufacture. So again, we turn to experiment, and there are lots of people now that have learned how to make stone tools and use various techniques to produce them. So we build up a variety of knowledge then about these things. And of course, that's what the archaeologist wants. See, the arrowhead, the spear point, it's a beautiful object. It has an aesthetic to it that's very nice, and particularly made out of this stone. It's a very pretty object. It's an object from the past, so certainly we might be interested in it just simply because of its age. But that isn't what the archaeologist is interested in. They're interested in then, how did this thing operate? How did it function in some prehistoric culture? How was it made? When was it made? How was it used? Where did they get the stone? How did they use the stone? What kinds of animals did they use to hunt with it, and so forth and so on. So a lot of why and how questions that go along with arrowheads and so forth are what archaeology is really after.
What about other kinds of artifacts like pottery?
Pottery is a whole other ballgame altogether. One of the interesting things about pottery in comparison to the stone tools is that because we're using a different type of material, particularly using clay, which we can mold into different fashions and also use different techniques to decorate, it means then that we open up a tremendous variety of techniques of manufacture and decoration that we don't have with stone tools. It also means that particular groups of people can experiment and can also develop styles of pottery that are somewhat unique to themselves. Pottery is what we call a very plastic medium. That is, it's a very malleable thing. People can make different sizes of pots, decorate them in different ways. So that pottery tells us a different kind of information than does the arrowheads. Now, pottery in North Dakota is a fairly recent event, and it is a fairly recent event throughout the world. In North Dakota, it appears that pottery first appears perhaps as early as 400, 500 years before Christ, although not in a great abundance. But that's probably about the time period when we first see pottery in North Dakota, so that we don't have the length of time with pottery as we do with stone tools. So we talk about stone tools in North Dakota as early as 10,000 BC, but pottery not until perhaps 500 years before Christ. So we don't have as much variety, say, through time with pottery as we do with the stone tools. Now, pottery is also of interest, and one of the puzzling things that we see in North Dakota and in the Plains region as a whole as to what happens to the kinds of vessels that people made prehistorically. Our earliest pots are very thick and are very pointed in bottom. These pots will not stand up by themselves. If you were to put one of these pots on the floor or on the table, it would simply fall over. So you have to have some type of artificial support. And the interesting thing is it appears it takes perhaps as long as 500, 600 years of people experimenting and making pottery before they start to make round-bottom vessels, pots that will support themselves. And it seems like such a logical thing. I mean, you'd think if you were making a pot and you wanted to hold a liquid or a soup or stew or whatever it might be in the pot, that you'd want to make it right away, figure out right away that some way of trying to keep this pot from falling over. But obviously it takes quite a while for people to experiment, perhaps learning how to use the clays right, how to fire the clays and so forth, before they develop vessels that will be suitable for that type of purpose. Indeed, pottery has been one of the major kinds of artifacts that archaeologists have dealt with here in North Dakota and throughout most of North America.
What kinds of processes do archaeologists use to date materials of the various kinds that they find in sites?
Archaeologists use dating techniques that essentially are very identical to those used by the geological sciences. There are two basic kinds of dating techniques used, two groups of dating techniques. The first and the primary one is what we call relative dating. This is a situation in which we are attempting to determine whether one object, one artifact, or one archaeological site, or one prehistoric culture is older or younger than another. And the question is then, is something older or younger than something else? At that point, we're not asking how many years different, but just simply whether something is older or younger. And that's the primary question that has to be asked. That's one of the essential questions that all archaeologists deal with, and is one of the first questions that has to be dealt with before we begin any kind of analysis. We have to have an idea where we are in time, so that, again, whether we're dealing with an object that might be 10,000 years old or whether it be 5,000 years old, has a lot of bearing in terms of the kinds of other questions we might ask. So we look at, essentially then, if we're excavating a site, we would be looking at the various layers of soil and earth, not only the natural layers, the wind that's been blown in, say here in North Dakota where we get a lot of wind-blown deposits and so forth. So we might have layers of wind-blown deposits, layers of water-lane deposits, and layers of human garbage intermixed between that. So we first of all want to recognize what are those layers, what are contained within them, and then compare those layers one to another. Is, in fact, if we observe a situation where we have one style of, say, pottery a foot below the ground and another style of pottery 2 feet below the ground, do we assume at that point that the deepest pottery, that is, that pottery that's 2 feet below the ground, should we assume that that's the oldest pottery? Now that's an assumption we make when we start out. Because it's deeper or lower in the ground, it's therefore older. But that may not be the case. And there are all types of reasons, both natural reasons, burrowing animals, tree roots, frost, earthquakes, as well as human reasons, that is people digging garbage pits, digging house foundations, whatever it might be, that could disturb that, so that actually the older materials through some type of disturbance activity might be closer to the surface of the ground. So we have to work that out first, and that can be a very difficult situation, particularly when we deal with older and older sites that have had various kinds of disturbance activities going on through time. So once we work that out, though, once we safely assume and feel now that we can say this object is younger or older than some other object, then we move to that next question, which is the one everybody wants to answer, is, well, how old? How many years old is that object or that site? And there then we turn to a whole variety of different techniques, and of course radiocarbon dating is the one that most people have heard about or perhaps familiar with, in which then we're looking at the remains of organic carbon associated, that is, in context, next to the objects that we want to date. So again, if we're looking at a piece of pottery or an arrowhead, we can't use radiocarbon dating to date those themselves, but rather date other materials that are found with them. So for instance, if we found some charcoal, or maybe a charred corn cob, or a piece of wood, or a piece of even animal bone can be used in some cases, that is at the same level, the same layer, then we date that, and if we can safely assume that the arrow points are from the same level below the ground, then we can be fairly certain the arrow point dates from about the same time period as that piece of organic carbon. It's a very complex process. And again, while we talk about it providing us with a date in terms of calendar years, it actually provides us with a range of dates, and we just simply take a statistical average of those dates. That is, it actually doesn't tell us, well, this was made in 1452 or made in 3005 or whatever, but tells us that we have a chance, a 2 out of 3 chance that the date falls within a particular period of time. So radiocarbon dating is the primary tool used by most archaeologists throughout the world. Now another technique, which was, by the way, pioneered in North Dakota, a lot of people don't realize this, was pioneered here, but it hasn't been used for quite some time, is tree ring dating, or what's called dendrochronology, in which then we look at count back the growth rings on trees, and then develop a calendar back in time, so that we take modern trees, look at their rings, take trees from old barns and buildings, match those rings up, and then move into the archaeological record, matching rings up and extending then a chart of tree rings back in time. And with that, particularly in the American Southwest, many people feel, archaeologists in the Southwest feel, that that's even more accurate than radiocarbon dating, that technique. Unfortunately, we don't have much wood in North Dakota. I think everybody realizes that. And the types of wood that we have predominant here along our streams and rivers isn't very suitable for this technique, so the technique hasn't been expanded in North Dakota.
What kinds of things have archaeologists been able to learn about the occupations of early peoples in North Dakota, whether they were hunters or farmers, or what kinds of evidence is there in the archaeological record?
This is probably one of my favorite questions. One of the things that I'd like to stress to people, not only in the state but elsewhere, is that while we have an image of the Native American as a hunter, that is hunting particularly bison on the Great Plains or deer or whatever, and that certainly was an important activity here in North Dakota, that there were also peoples that were predominantly farmers, raising of varieties of corn, beans, squash, melons, and so forth. And here in North Dakota, for instance, I think it can be safely estimated that for the time period, say, from about 1,200 years, AD 1,200 years after Christ, from about 1,200 to 1,800 AD, I think we could suggest that the majority of people living in North Dakota were farmers. Not that they didn't do hunting, they did a lot of hunting. But here I'm talking about the Earth Lodge peoples, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, who lived here in the state, principally along the Missouri River. had tremendous gardens and tremendous villages. And we tend to forget that. History has forgotten a lot about these farming peoples. I think it's too bad because it gives us another clue as to the diversity of ways of life of these people in the past that we need to appreciate and understand.
What kinds of different evidences in particular do you look for? What kind of sites do we have in North Dakota? Do we have sites that deal with a buffalo kill? Do we have sites that indicate exactly what was farmed in terms of the archaeological record?
There are quite a variety of archaeological sites in North Dakota. Obviously, and I think perhaps this would be true for most states, the most common type of archaeological site would be the village or campsite. That is a location where people lived, made and used their tools, butchered their animals, and so forth and so on. And those are very common throughout the state. The villages along the Missouri Valley here, particularly the Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples, are very large, very spectacular villages and very noticeable. And those have been known for quite some time. Other types of sites would include the Knife River Flint Quarry sites out in the west central part of the state where we have quarry pits into the ground where people mined flint. The eagle trapping sites out in the Badlands where people went to trap eagles for their feathers and so forth. We actually know the locations of prehistoric trails in some parts of the state where we can follow routes that people took over many, many years. The eastern part of the state, particularly east of the Missouri River, is dotted with hundreds, perhaps thousands of prehistoric burial mounds, earthen mounds that people used to bury their dead as prehistoric cemeteries. There are a few, not very many in North Dakota, but a few bison jumps, that is locations where buffalo were stampeded over the sides of cliffs. And of course, that's almost a North Dakota joke in terms of Montana, that we don't have much relief in North Dakota, and the few hills we do have were taken advantage of by the prehistoric peoples to stampede their bison. But we have very few of those, and they're mainly in the western part of the state. Those would be perhaps the principal kinds of archaeological sites. There are a few others that we do know about in North Dakota.
We would like to thank Dr. Fred Schneider from the University of North Dakota for talking to us about North Dakota archaeology. This has been another conversation in North Dakota history. I am Virginia Heidenreich.